Breaking news, you're looking at video of one of the last times Oscar winner Gene Hackman, a known recluse in recent years.
Now with new details on the investigation into the death of actor Gene Hackman, including newly released video.
As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that release, citing privacy.
February 26, 2025. A maintenance worker walks up to a gated property on Old Sunset Trail in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's worked this job for 16 years. He peers through a window, the way he has 100 times before to check on the couple who live there. This time, something is wrong. He calls 911. His voice on the recording is urgent, almost pleading. "Please send someone out here quick," he tells the dispatcher. They are not moving. Inside, deputies find two bodies. One of the most decorated actors in American film history, 95-year-old Gene Hackman, and his wife of 33 years, 65-year-old classical pianist Betsy Arakawa. A dog is also found dead nearby. Two other dogs survive. There's no forced entry. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Nothing broken. Just silence, and a story that would take investigators more than 2 months to fully piece together. This is not a story about hidden tunnels or secret chambers. It's something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling. The story of how two private, self-sufficient people slipped out of the world without anyone noticing, and what that reveals about isolation, illness, and the limits of even a privileged life. To understand how this happened, you have to understand who Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were in their later years, not the public figures, but the people behind the gate. Hackman won 2 Academy Awards across a career that included The French Connection, The Conversation, Unforgiven, and Hoosiers. He retired from acting in the early 2000s and, by most accounts, meant it. He moved to Santa Fe, took up painting, wrote novels, and largely disappeared from the entertainment industry's orbit. Arakawa, born in Hawaii and trained as a concert pianist, met Hackman in the mid-1980s while working at a California gym. They married in 1991. Friends who spoke to the press after their deaths described a devoted, low-key partnership. He was a gentle giant, very calm, one friend, Kevin Bobolowski, said in an ABC News special on the couple's final days. Arakawa, by most accounts, managed the household, cooking, cleaning, and increasingly caregiving. That last role matters more than almost anything else in this story. Hackman's retreat from public life wasn't cinematic paranoia. It was ordinary. Santa Fe is full of people, artists, writers, retirees, who came for exactly what the city offers: distance from Los Angeles and New York, dramatic landscape, and a community that, by long-standing local custom, tends to leave celebrities alone. Locals have talked for years about running into Hackman at the farmer's market or getting his order at a local restaurant without a second glance. That's not a conspiracy. That's Santa Fe functioning, as it usually does for people who want to be left alone. What made the property harder to observe from outside wasn't some engineered fortress. It was ordinary security for a person of Hackman's wealth and profile, a gated community, some privacy landscaping, a household with irregular staff visits. Court documents released after the deaths noted that the county had flagged several minor code violations at the home, including a small gas leak in a stove burner. New Mexico Gas Company investigated and confirmed the leak was minuscule, not nearly enough to be lethal, and unrelated to the deaths. There is no credible report from the sheriff's office, the medical investigator, the FBI, which was not the lead agency on this case, or any established outlet, describing a hidden passage, an underground chamber, unexplained artifacts, or any of the elements sometimes used to sensationalize this story. Those details do not appear in any search warrant affidavit, autopsy report, or verified news account. They belong to speculative content that circulated online in the months after the deaths, not to the investigation itself. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office led the investigation, with support from a New Mexico office of the medical investigator, OMI, and forensic specialists. Early statements from Sheriff Adán Mendoza described the scene as suspicious enough in nature to require a thorough search and investigation, standard language for any unexplained death of this kind, not an indication of foul play. Investigators quickly ruled out several possibilities. Carbon monoxide poisoning was tested and came back negative for both Hackman and Arakawa, with levels well within a normal range. The minor gas leak found during a subsequent inspection was deemed too small to have been a factor. There were no signs of external or internal trauma on either body. Prescription pill bottles were found near Arakawa, later identified as her thyroid medication, taken as prescribed and not implicated in her death. One of the more visually striking details reported early on was the condition of the bodies. Arakawa's body showed bloating and a degree of mummification in her hands and feet, consistent with having been deceased for some time in the home's dry climate before discovery. Hackman's body showed similar signs of decomposition. This was one of the clearest physical indicators investigators had that the couple had died on different days, well before their bodies were found. Digital forensics gave investigators the clearest window into Arakawa's final days. A search of her computer showed she had researched COVID-19 symptoms and flu-like symptoms multiple times between February 8th and February 11th. An email she sent to her massage therapist on February 11th mentioned that Hackman had taken a COVID test after experiencing cold or flu-like symptoms. Records also showed Arakawa had called a local health clinic, Cloudberry Health, on February 12th seeking medical attention, but she never received it. That trail goes cold after February 12th. It's the last confirmed evidence of Betsy Arakawa reaching out for help. Nearly 2 months after the deaths on March 7, 2025, New Mexico's chief medical investigator, Dr. Heather Jarrell, held a press conference to lay out the findings. What she described was not a mystery solved by uncovering something hidden. It was 2 separate, tragic medical timelines that happened to intersect in the same house. Betsy Arakawa died first and likely alone. The medical examiner determined her cause of death was hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but serious respiratory illness contracted through exposure to infected rodent droppings, urine, or saliva. It is not contagious between people. It comes directly from contact with rodents or contaminated dust, most commonly in poorly ventilated spaces. New Mexico has one of the higher rates of hantavirus exposure in the country because of the deer mice population in the region, though even there it remains rare. Public health officials cited roughly 136 confirmed cases in the state over the previous 50 years, with a fatality rate close to 40%. Hantavirus typically begins with flu-like symptoms, fever, muscle aches, cough, that can last several days before the illness suddenly progresses to fluid buildup in the lungs and cardiac or respiratory failure. That progression matches almost exactly what investigators found in Arakawa's search history and communications. She believed she might have COVID or the flu. She was, in effect, treating the wrong illness. By the time hantavirus reaches its critical phase, decline can happen within 24 to 48 hours, and Dr. Jarrell noted it isn't uncommon for people to be found collapsed on the floor as part of what she called a terminal collapse. Arakawa's body was found on the floor of a bathroom near the front door. The medical examiner placed her likely date of death around February 11th, the same day as her last documented outreach for medical help. Hackman's death came later, and by a different mechanism entirely. His autopsy showed severe, long-standing cardiovascular disease, atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, a history of congestive heart failure, multiple coronary artery stents, a bypass graft, and a prior aortic valve replacement. He had received a biventricular pacemaker in April 2019. That pacemaker turned out to be one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It recorded his heart's activity up until it stopped, and investigators determined the last recorded activity occurred around February 17th or 18th, roughly a week after Betsy's death. Just as significant was what examiners found in his brain, microscopic evidence of advanced-stage Alzheimer's disease. This wasn't a passing detail. It reframed the entire question that had hung over the case from the beginning. How could a 95-year-old man share a home with his deceased wife for a week without calling anyone? When a reporter asked Dr. Jarrell directly whether Hackman had known his wife was dead, she was careful and honest. That question's difficult to answer, but I can tell you that he was in an advanced state of Alzheimer's, and it's quite possible that he was not aware that she was deceased. That single sentence does more to explain this case than any theory involving hidden chambers ever could. Arakawa was, by every account from friends and family, Hackman's primary caregiver in his final years, managing his medication, his meals, his daily needs. When she collapsed and died, there may have been no one left in that house, in any functional sense, capable of understanding what had happened or calling for help. Toxicology supported this grim picture. Hackman's stomach contained no food, indicating he hadn't eaten in the days before his death, though the medical examiner found no signs of dehydration. A small amount of acetone was detected in his blood, a marker that can appear during prolonged fasting or metabolic stress, consistent with a period of not eating. Sheriff Mendoza noted there was no indication of any caretaker present in the home during this period. Hackman also tested negative for hantavirus, ruling out the possibility that he contracted the same illness as his wife. One of the couple's 3 dogs was found dead in a crate near Arakawa's body. Officials said dogs cannot contract hantavirus and suggested the dog's death was more likely related to dehydration or starvation after being left unattended, another quiet indicator of just how long the household had gone without anyone functioning inside it. The most haunting part of the story isn't a locked door or an unexplained artifact. It's the ordinary, well-documented reality of what can happen when an aging couple relies almost entirely on each other, with few outside supports, and one of them is the other's only caregiver. Friends interviewed after the deaths suggested Arakawa likely underestimated how sick she was. "I'm sure if Betsy knew how sick she was, she would have had some backup help," one friend, Stephen Marshall, said in the ABC News documentary, The Last Days of Gene Hackman. "She probably thought she was going to get better. She wasn't worried about herself. She was worried about taking care of Gene." That single impulse, worrying about her husband's care rather than her own symptoms, may be the most decisive factor in the entire tragedy. She sought help for herself only once, a phone call to a clinic that never resulted in treatment, before a fast-moving illness overtook her. From there, the household had no safety net. There's no indication of a live-in nurse, a rotating home health aide, or regular family check-ins during that specific week. Hackman, deep into Alzheimer's, would not have had the capacity to recognize the medical emergency unfolding around him, to use a phone effectively, or possibly even to fully register that his wife of more than 3 decades was gone. He continued on whatever remained of his own internal routine until his heart, already severely damaged after a lifetime of cardiovascular disease, gave out roughly a week later. This is tragically not a unique pattern. Elder care researchers and geriatricians have long documented the risks facing couples where one spouse is the primary, informal caregiver for a partner with advanced dementia, and that caregiver's own health is overlooked. When the caregiver becomes incapacitated or dies suddenly, the person with dementia can be left without anyone able to recognize or respond to the crisis. Wealth and privacy, in this instance, didn't prevent that outcome. If anything, the couple's intensely private lifestyle likely reduced the number of people who might otherwise have checked in. Part of why this case generated so much online speculation is straightforward. For roughly a week and a half, official statements were necessarily vague. Investigators genuinely didn't know the cause of death at first. Toxicology and full autopsy results, as the medical examiner's office repeatedly reminded reporters, can take months. Early statements calling the deaths suspicious enough to warrant investigation were standard procedure for any unattended death with no immediately obvious cause. Not evidence of a cover-up. That gap between "we don't have answers yet" and "here are the final results," stretched across roughly 2 months for the full autopsy report, created space for online speculation to fill in the blanks. This is an extremely common pattern in high-profile, unexplained deaths. Uncertainty gets treated as evidence of concealment when it usually just reflects how slow toxicology and neuropathology testing actually is. Brain tissue analysis for something like Alzheimer's pathology, in particular, requires specialized microscopic examination that cannot be rushed. The FBI's near-total absence from public comment on this case, sometimes cited as suspicious, has a much simpler explanation. This was a local jurisdiction case handled by the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office and the State Medical Investigator's Office. There's no substantiated report of the FBI leading or even significantly participating in this investigation, which undercuts any narrative built around federal containment or suppression. Investigators did conduct a search of the home under warrant, as is standard in any unattended death investigation of this kind. Publicly available search warrant inventories describe ordinary household items, prescription medications including blood pressure and thyroid medication, over-the-counter pain relievers, a cane and sunglasses found near where Hackman's body was located in a mudroom near the kitchen. The New Mexico Gas Company's separate inspection identified several code violations, most of them minor and unrelated to the deaths, plumbing and electrical issues typical of an older, sprawling property, not sealed vaults or hidden mechanisms. None of the release documentation, not the search warrant affidavits, not the sheriff's statements, not the medical examiner's reports, references any hidden passage, underground chamber, historical artifacts, or unexplained construction beneath the home. Claims describing such discoveries do not trace back to any law enforcement source, court filing, or established news organization. They exist only in speculative online content published after the case drew national attention. It's worth addressing directly the temptation to read Hackman's on-screen roles, the paranoid surveillance expert in The Conversation, the man hunted by his own government in Enemy of the State, as some kind of foreshadowing of real hidden danger in his life. That's a compelling narrative device, but it's exactly that, a narrative device. Actors play roles. Audiences, understandably, sometimes conflate a performer's most memorable characters with the performer himself, especially when that performer spent his later decades deliberately out of the public eye. What his real retirement reveals is much less dramatic and arguably more relatable. A man in his 80s and 90s dealing with the ordinary, devastating realities of cardiovascular disease and progressive dementia, largely cared for by a devoted spouse who is quietly managing more than most people around them likely realized. Friends recalled Hackman's warmth at local businesses, his memory for names and small details about people's lives, genuine human traits, not clues in a conspiracy. His retreat from Hollywood was consistent with what many people who knew him described for years, someone who had said what he wanted to say through his work and simply wanted a quiet life afterward. Strip away the speculation, and what remains is a case that public health officials and elder care advocates have pointed to as a stark illustration of a real and growing problem. The vulnerability of elderly couples living in relative isolation, where one spouse's health crisis can cascade into tragedy for both, especially when cognitive decline in one partner removes the ability to seek help even when it's desperately needed. Betsy Arakawa's path, flu-like symptoms, self-directed research instead of urgent in-person care, one unanswered call for help, then a sudden and fatal turn, is a pattern hantavirus specialists have described before precisely because the illness so often masquerades as something far more common and far less dangerous in its early stages. Her focus on her husband's needs over her own symptoms is a dynamic caregiver support organizations frequently warn about. Gene Hackman's final days, alone in a house with no functional caregiver, in advanced Alzheimer's, with a heart that had been failing for years, is a scenario families and geriatric physicians recognize immediately, even if the specific outcome rarely makes international news. There was no hidden tunnel. There was no ancient chamber, no unexplained device, no sealed door. There was an aging private couple, deeply devoted to each other, undone by two serious and largely unrelated illnesses that struck within days of one another, in a household that had, by circumstance rather than design, no one else positioned to notice in time. That is, in the end, a sadder and more universal story than any manufactured mystery could be, and it's the one that's actually supported by the record.